Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day in 1939, the nation is enraptured by the hit movie of the year, one of the first movies to truly showcase the power of Technicolor film, The Wizard of Oz. And I don't know if they talked about in 1939 the so-called four-quadrant movies, but that's the term they use for movies that appeal to all the main demographics, male, female, people over 25, people under 25. But this movie kind of has it all. It has funny characters, musical numbers, action. And then there is the often ignored fifth quadrant of the movie-going public, monetary policy conspiracy theorists. Because basically, since this movie came out, and even before then, since the book that the movie was based on came out, there have been theories about what the gold means, what the silver means, whether the Tin Man represents the industrial age and the Scarecrow represents the common farmer who was being squeezed by modern America. And that, of course, is not to mention the many other theories that have come out about what this movie means as a religious allegory. And then in the 80s, we get The Wiz, which remade it with an all-black cast. And then, of course, now we have Wicked, the musical, now the hit movie, which layers on all sorts of other meaning and room for interpretation. So The Wizard of Oz is, as they say, a very, very rich text, and we want to dive in with a quick tour of all the ways that people have overthought The Wizard of Oz over the years. So here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our guest for this episode is Ranjit Dighe, who is an economic history professor at SUNY Oswego, who has written multiple papers about the politics of Wizard of Oz, and L. Frank Baum, who's the person who wrote the book in 1900. And Ranjit, you also edited a sort of compendium of essays called, what was it called? The Historian's Wizard of Oz. Yeah. Right. So you are the person for the job. Thank you. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Ranjit.
Thanks for having me.
We all have thoughts on Wicked. I've seen it. Kelly's seen it. I'm sure you've seen it and have many thoughts about the way
I haven't seen it. I read the book. I liked it.
Oh, no. Well, there you go. You read the book. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of talking about 2 books and like 3 movies, right? And so there's a lot, right? There's a lot of material out there. But let's focus actually on the 1939 movie and specifically the theory that emerges, actually not in 1939, you can tell us when, Ranjit, but the theory that emerges about it as a kind of allegory for banking and industrialization. So 1900, Frank Baum publishes the book. 1939, this movie comes out. I think I'm roughly correct that it's sometime in the 1960s, actually, this theory about what it actually means comes out. But sort of walk us through what the sort of core canon theory about what The Wizard of Oz means is, and then we'll start to complicate it.
Okay. Well, as you said, the book comes out. L. Frank Baum's book comes out in 1900. And really, for 6 decades, nobody really talks about political or economic symbolism in it. It begins with a guy who was a future history PhD named Henry Littlefield. At the time, he was teaching high school history. I think it was summer school, he said. And it was a typical summer school kind of thing where it's very hard to engage the students. But he was a big fan of The Wizard of Oz, both the movie and the books. And he was reading from the Oz books to his children at the same time that he was teaching about monetary populism and William Jennings Bryan to his students. And he's like, it seems like there's a lot of commonalities here. And that was basically it. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was just, hey, there's a lot of things in common here. Just like you can take any TV show and say it's about your friends or something like that.
Right.
You can relate a lot of things. There's a lot of, political columnists and cartoonists who do that all the time, just relating what's going on in the world to pop culture. And that's what Littlefield did. And he did a little bit of homework. I mean, really just a little. There wasn't too much available to work with with L. Frank Baum's biography. There's a whole generation of Baum scholars now who could tell you exactly why that story is wrong.
So we'll pick that apart, but I just want to clarify one thing, which is, this banking crisis that this teacher in the 60s is trying to teach his students about and get them to care about. That's the monetary crisis of 1896.
Right.
Baum writes his book in 1900. So at least timeline-wise, it kind of syncs up in saying okay, this person was writing this book in the wake of this interesting monetary crisis. Maybe these things were swirling in the air.
It syncs up perfectly. I mean, Baum was politically engaged to some degree. There's no chance that he never thought about Bryan or McKinley in the time that he was writing this book, that it didn't cross his mind. Though, of course, that's not proof that he intended any of these things. You could say that in some subconscious, very indirect way, they might have influenced what he was doing. But that is, the type of thing that's just impossible to prove.
Yeah. Can you inhabit this teacher in the 1960s? Pretend we're your disaffected students. What is the metaphor that explains the banking crisis as seen in The Wizard of Oz, as this teacher tried to lay out?
Okay, boy, it's been tackled a bunch of different ways. I think Littlefield's 1964 article in the American Quarterly, The Wizard of Oz, Parable on Populism, is a terrific paper. It's really well done. He doesn't go over the top in saying, it was absolutely like this. There's no other possible interpretation. And he weaves it all together really nicely. Again, it's tricky. It's really hard to see this as, all that strongly a pro-gold standard or anti-gold standard tract. But it's a monetary metaphor in the sense that Dorothy is wearing silver shoes, and those allow her to navigate the yellow brick road. And gold and silver together as the monetary base, gold coins and silver coins, were exactly what the monetary populists like William Jennings Bryan wanted, bimetallism. That had been the standard or the dual standard for America for more than 100 years, but we were moving towards a de facto gold standard. The country wasn't minting any more silver coins, and there was a deflation going on in the 1890s. Deflation is bad for farmers and bad for a lot of people, like anybody who's in debt. And Bryan thought if you ended the deflation, then that would be good for the economy. And that's pretty much what economists, part of, macroeconomic, theory and policy today. We don't like deflation. We don't like inflation, but deflation is something to be avoided at all costs.
And the kind of cool thing about the Oz allegory, I totally understand historically all the reasons why it's not the right fit, but it works so well. Exactly. So you have silver and gold marching together to the Emerald City of Oz. Yeah. Oz is short for ounces. And you have her companions. You have the Scarecrow, who's the embattled farmer. And you have the Tin Man, which is the sort of man stripped of his soul as an industrial worker. And the Cowardly Lion, who is William Jennings Bryan. Dorothy is coming from Kansas, the home of the populist movement.
Vicky's a true believer.
I know, it's so good. You like bringing the farmers and the workers together. The thing that I find, but it's obviously very useful as a teaching allegory. And because it's so easy to sort of like pick up each piece and then like slot it in somewhere into the populist and the bimetallism movement, it is one of those things that, again, historically, you and other people have shown like why this doesn't fit Baum's politics, that it was a theory that is generated 60 years later, but it works so well that it feels like one of those things that...
where the lie is better than the true story.
Yeah, I think so. Where like the debunking is both extremely valid and you're just like, but... it works so well.
Yeah. It's not satisfying to think of it in any other way.
Which is why I think it's caught on and why I think that it has so many like afterlives past the 1960s is that people hear it and they're like, that works really well. All right. I like that.
Yeah.
That and the fact that it's a popular film. I mean, like this would be considered a blockbuster by all standards. I mean, people have so much nostalgia connected to this film, especially because of the Technicolor, especially because of the vibrancy of the film. It starts out black and white, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion of color when she gets to Oz. And I could see how, as a child, as a young adult, as an adult watching this film, how it could imprint on you in a way that would make you want to recall it again and again for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, I agree completely with those sentiments. That's kind of the conclusion I reach in this essay in The Historian's Wizard of Oz, which goes through, how this parable interpretation came to be and the debunking of it over the years. And I say it's still a great teaching tool. It's a metaphor. It's an extended metaphor. And that's kind of fun because the students can contribute their own interpretations, if you read the book or if you watch the movie. We use metaphors all the time in the classroom. I teach economics, and in macroeconomics, we say, imagine, a helicopter that drops lots of money. What impact is that going to have on the price level in the economy? Of course, there's no helicopter that drops money. Maybe at a minor league baseball game or something, but other than that, so it's useful. Unfortunately, I would say it's increasingly less useful just because, our pop culture today is a lot more fragmented than it was like when I wrote my book, 20, 25 years ago. I have lots of students who've never watched The Wizard of Oz.
But in the 60s, it was still as much of a it was a real touchstone cultural force that you could sort of point to it and have a sort of common.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a child of the 70s. We watched it every year.
Yeah.
And so that was before you had, videos that you would watch, that kids would watch every day.
Right.
And bother their parents with.
Did this professor, who I think was also a wrestling coach, but did he comes up with this theory? Does he know that he's imposing this theory, or does he really believe that I've uncovered Baum's real kind of goals here, or is he doing what, like you just said, it's a useful metaphor. I'm using this.
I think he believed it, but not in a true believer sense.
Yeah.
He said, evidence seems to suggest that this is where Baum thought, that he was a progressive Democrat and would have favored bimetallism and William Jennings Bryan. He did recant. There's a semi-scholarly magazine or journal called the Baum Bugle, and he was interviewed in that, or he wrote an essay for that, and he said, my article is perfect, but yeah, I really kind of made this stuff up.
Except for the fact that I made it up.
He seemed very good humored about it.
Yeah.
I never got to interview him when I was writing my book because he died shortly before.
Right.
I got a chance.
You've explained this a little bit, but I mean, Baum was a political figure, and I think you pointed out how maybe his politics didn't fully align with the theory that's imposed there. But it's not out of the question that he would be writing about the monetary, or have the monetary crisis and these figures in his head, because I think it's worth, we've done episodes on this period, but it's worth reminding listeners, this really was one of the defining political fractures of the time. And so if you're sitting down and you're politically minded, you're writing an ambitious text with interesting themes, maybe it would seep in.
Yeah, Baum wrote a lot of books. I mean, they're almost all aimed at a children's audience. I haven't read them all, but I've read the ones that I'd heard had some political element to them. Usually when he goes political, he is not the least bit subtle about it.
Right.
So the idea that he would have written this extended metaphor that was so subtle that no one even noticed it for 60 years is really far-fetched.
Hey, it's Jody. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone who has already donated to Radiotopia's fall fundraiser. And if you are listening and you haven't donated to the network before, you might wonder where exactly your dollars go. Well, the short answer is that it goes into making 3 episodes of this show every week. You hear the names of the folks who help make the program. Our researcher, Jacob, our producer, Brittany, Kaula, who does the transcripts, and of course, Nikki and Kelly and me. And I'm a big believer that people should be paid for doing that kind of work. Look, I want to be clear about something. No one is getting rich off of this show. But I've been proud of the fact that over the years, even as the media landscape has gotten rockier and rockier, and we have ridden that roller coaster of ad dollars going up and down, we have still found a way to do it. And I'll be honest, there are months where it's really, really tight. There are some months where I don't come out in the black, but I still value making this show and supporting the people who help make this show. And I think it is important to keep plugging away, paying people for their fair share and their hard work. And I can't say this enough. Listener support is a huge part of the puzzle that I just described of how we make it work. We literally, figuratively, metaphorically, pick your Ali, we could not do it without you, really. So, if you can, take a moment and become a member of Radiotopia. You can do it right now at radiotopia.fm/donate. It's tax deductible, and yes, there is a sweetener. When you do, you'll receive a special curated playlist from Radiotopia that we put together just for you. It's very cool. Go check it out. Again, radiotopia.fm/donate. And thank you. All right, let's get on with the show.
The 2024 election is upon us, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But the outcome might not be clear till long after everyone has voted. If the race ends up being as close as it looks right now, we could be in for a repeat, or worse, of the year 2000, when the presidency came down to a recount in Florida that ended at the Supreme Court. To hear the whole story, check out Fiasco, Bush v. Gore, a podcast from the co-creators of Slow Burn. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
We've talked about, what Dorothy might represent and what the silver and the gold might represent. What was the theory, or are there other provocative theories about what Oz himself represents? I mean, I think maybe in the 60s, as part of this teaching tool, it was kind of like we had a series of weak presidents in the sort of late 1800s into the 1900s, and maybe Oz is just showing that, these so-called leaders don't actually have their act together. But what are the other kind of ways to interpret that figure himself?
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on there. One is the Emerald City. The Emerald City is just dazzling. It's from walking, through the forest into the Emerald City. It's beautiful. It's all green and really bright. In fact, when they get to the gates, the guardian of the gates gives them these little glasses they have to put on so they won't be dazzled with how striking everything is. The glasses are green. It's actually white, but the green glasses, make it look like the color of money. So it's kind of a neat little metaphor for money, because right now, we have fiat money. It does not have any gold or silver content in it. It's not redeemable by the government for gold or silver. But because everybody believes it has value, it has value. So I think that's a really neat metaphor right there. The wizard is really just this bumbling little man. He can't even get his hot air balloon off the ground correctly at the end. And they've just imagined that he has all this incredible power. And that's a metaphor for the ages. But presidents are a lot more powerful now than in the 1890s, but they still are credited for or blamed for all sorts of things like macroeconomic performance that they really have very little to do with.
We imbue a lot of power with presidents in the same way that we did with Oz. There's this belief that he can get you home, and he can get you a heart, and he can get you a brain, and he can get you all of these different things. Only to find out, no, he does not.
He can cancel your student loans. He can get you a stimulus check.
Cancel your student loans. He can't do any of that.
Yeah, you can imagine people reading this and putting on a Christian allegory to it, or kind of false gods allegory to it. I mean, that's the thing about a rich allegory, is that there are so many different things that people can read into it. And especially when you have that symbolism of a dazzling city run by a false god, it feels like there's so much richness in the story itself for people to read into it, whatever they're most interested in.
Well, can we start to then maybe talk about some of the other readings into this? And I do want to get to The Wiz, actually, in the 80s, and I want to get to Now and Wicked. Wiz. I know, I love it too. But actually, the movie, one thing I'm struck by is the book comes out in 1900. The theory about the movie comes in the 60s. The movie itself, though, comes out in 1939, is a huge hit. It's landing in the sort of wake of the Great Depression and the run-up to World War II. Are there not tons of theories sort of put on it at that time? It feels like a very fraught moment where a text this rich would certainly be open to a lot of theories.
Yeah, there were some. I wrote a little about that. Michael Patrick Hearn, who is, I'm not sure if he finished it, but he's exhaustively working on a biography of Baum. He may have finished it by now. He wrote the original annotated Wizard of Oz. I've talked with him a few times. He's an incredible resource on this subject. He said that, no, there's absolutely no evidence that L. Frank Baum's book was a political or monetary allegory of any kind. But there might be something regarding the movie. Because Yip Harburg, who wrote a lot of the music and the dialogue, was very much a political animal, much more so than Baum. And Yip Harburg said in an interview, which I tracked down, that the Emerald City was the New Deal. This was at a time when I think MGM and some of the other studios were being really urged by the New Dealers, perhaps even the White House, to make the movies optimistic, to buoy the American spirits. Where exactly The Wizard of Oz fits in with that is not completely clear, but, it's a movie that has a happy ending, and you go to this fabulous place, and then you decide what you really want is just to be home.
And there's just an agrarian ideal in that movie that I feel like probably resonated with a lot of people coming off of the Great Depression, kind of let's reconnect with the heartland. Yeah, that makes sense.
That certainly goes with the New Deal coalition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, L. Frank Baum came from kind of somewhat agrarian origins in Chittenango, New York, which is now a suburb of Syracuse, more or less. But that's not really what he himself wanted. He moved to Chicago and then to Los Angeles.
You know, it occurs to me, we talk about this on the show a lot too, but like, you know, one of the more fascinating parts of history is not what happened, but about people's stories about what happened and how those reflect the moment in which those stories get created. And I guess I'm realizing it's not a coincidence that the kind of two big narrative moments around this text were in the 1960s and now, you know, like those are just really fraught moments where people are looking for grounding and looking for stories. And, you know, I think it's not a coincidence that those are maybe the two moments when, you know, and it could have been anything, but I think this text, as you're saying, is like this, it's rich enough that you can find the meaning if you're already kind of thinking about that stuff.
But I just wanted to note that Littlefield's article and what he did with the students was based on Baum's book, not on the movie. Lots more people have seen the movie than read the books, but back in the 20th century, those books were wildly popular. They were kind of like the Harry Potter series of their time.
Well, people read into Harry Potter too.
Boy, do they.
I guess this is where we should point out something I learned recently, but like, you know, the slippers are originally silver, which scans with this metaphor, and then they get turned into ruby in the movie simply for like visual purpose, right? We want to show off. We want to show off the pop of color. So then, you know, so that shows you kind of the order of priority, right? It's like make a good movie, and then sure, maybe have some political metaphors subservient to that. There is a feminist sort of element to this as well, right? A lot of people, I think, in the 30s and 40s had a problem with the sort of Dorothy as a sort of woman with agency, right?
I do know that Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, was one of the most prominent or one of the most radical feminists of her time. She was, I mean, this is right around here, around Syracuse. So the legend goes is that she was so radical that she was kind of written out of the movement. I mean, she wouldn't be radical by today's feminism standards. You know, she thought marriage and the church were basically, you know, just tools of women's oppression, which you can say now, nobody bats an eye. But the 1890s, you know, that was verboten.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a story with all of these strong women characters, and then the man who is supposed to be incredibly powerful turns out to be just projecting an image of strength as opposed to being strong himself. I think there's an easy feminist reading for it, but I also like. I know we haven't talked about Wicked yet. I read the book. I haven't seen the movie, but Wicked too, I feel like has some pretty strong feminist themes in it as well. Yeah. So there's something to pull out of the book, even if it's not meant by Baum.
Well, let's get to Wicked in a minute, but I think we should make a stop at The Wiz, right?
Yes.
Yay! I love The Wiz. The Wiz is like, I watched The Wiz as a kid and probably watched it every year, if not multiple times a year. It's probably some of my first nightmares, like seeing the scene of them both in the poppies and the subway and like all of sort of the crazy, scary things that you know, came out of that. But I mean, Quincy Jones just died about a week or two ago, and thinking about how he shaped the music in that film, it is straight out of Motown. You know, it is such a Motown production. And that is what, I don't have a lot of intense allegory for The Wiz, but what stuck with me the most was just the representation of seeing an all-black cast and seeing a movie become sort of soulified, if you will. It was... Yeah, and I just also saw the Broadway play of The Wiz over the summer, and it was just like the music was spellbinding.
Yeah, it's really fun. One of the first movies I showed my daughter when she was getting into the movie watching age. It's at the very least, it's like the power of Quincy Jones to just pull all these people together and pull this thing off, right? He did it with the We Are the World, which we've done an episode about, and we did it with this. I mean, look, if we're giving ourselves permission to overthink stuff, a story about a bunch of black characters who are being promised riches and then it all falls through, you know, you don't have to go too far to find it.
You don't have to be very heavy-handed.
It's not an allegory so much as history.
I know.
All right, let's turn to Wicked the book and then Wicked the movie. So, you know, I actually don't know too much about Wicked the book, but it, I think, as an original text was sort of had some actual sort of political allegory in it too. What's your sense of that book and kind of what it's trying to say beyond just the sort of politics of the way it upends the very story itself of The Wizard of Oz?
You know, it comes out in the mid-1990s, and in some ways it's kind of the beginning of that anti-hero movement, or these books that try to, and stories that put the villain at the center of the story and try to tell complicate the story by telling it from the villain's point of view. And the villain is usually somebody who is rescued by that retelling, to be like, but look, why was I bad? I was bad for some really good reasons. And the book then explores all of that. It's a rich book. It's a very dark book in a lot of ways. But I feel like it was very much about turning storytelling on its head and taking some of these. I think Oz had become by that point in time a kind of fairy tale, and taking fairy tales, taking Greek myths, and putting the bad guy at the center to try to complicate them. And that's how I've always read Wicked and really enjoyed it for that reason.
And also seen how, again, not the film, but the theater production of Wicked is what sort of put it on the map. I also saw the Wicked production on Broadway. And I mean, and again, just sort of similar to Quincy Jones, like the music is what sets people off. I mean, the music is just incredible. And yeah, I think you still see a lot of the allegory. You still see sort of the mean girl vibe. You still get the anti-hero. You get, a cowardly wizard. You have all of these elements that are still there, but it's sort of like remastered or refabricated to give you a different subversive telling. Maybe I'm thinking a lot of like James, the book James that just won all the National Book Award prizes, Percival's book, and just how like you can take a story that is beloved and sort of like wait till it gets in public domain and then change the way that you think about this film and maybe subvert some of the characters and all of that stuff. And it's just another way of reimagining, I think, something that stuck with us so much.
Yeah. I mean, the book comes out in the mid-90s. The Broadway phenomenon really takes off in the 2000s. I think a lot of people have read it, and maybe rightly so, as a kind of Bush era, war in Iraq era kind of product. And certainly just the idea of what it has to say about fascism. I think that's not subtle in both the play and the movie itself. In addition to this idea of subverting who's the hero. But, there's marginalized groups. There's people who get pilloried for standing up for marginalized groups. There's people who are trying to act kind of expediently to cozy up to power. I mean, these are all things that people found at the time, and I think are certainly finding now. I mean, my main thought, I got to say, after watching the movie was, God, I'm really glad this didn't come out before the election, because just the deluge of think pieces would have been overwhelming. It would have been too much. I mean, they're already out there, and I'm curious, Ranjit, if you've seen them, but like it would have just been way too much. Every single op-ed would have been, and like I think a lot of rich texts, I also feel like anyone of any political persuasion could pick any character and basically hinge to that and be like, no, that's the good guy. No, that's the bad guy. That's the fascist. That's the anti-fascist. It just is like,
this
pick
is Kamala.
Pick your narrative.
No, that's not Kamala.
Exactly.
I mean, the fact that also that Elphaba is played by a black actress is something that like, and the duality of like, is she black? Is she green? Is green black? Like all of these different ways of thinking about race, and the solidarity or lack thereof between these two lead characters is something that, coming off of the heels of the election, I think it's impossible to not connect those ideas of black and white women's political relationships. And so some of it felt a little heavy-handed, like, okay, we get it, it's clear. But then there's the ways in which you think about a film long after you've watched it, and sort of like sit with these ideas of like how they will come back again and again and again. And yeah, I think this film might do that, given the fact that this film is also going to be like part one, part two, part three. I don't know how many different parts they're going to have to this film, but it will be in the cultural, atmosphere for a while.
And whatever the culture atmosphere of the moment is, people will sort of shove it onto this film.
Yes, they will.
But Ranjit, I know you haven't seen the film, and I know your focus is mostly on the original book and movie, but do you have thoughts either on the discourse you've observed, or just the fact that there continues to be just this powerful discourse all these years later around this text?
I think the thing this really shows, Nikki touched on this earlier, is just what a powerful story The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is. Just that it's so endlessly adaptable. Yeah. I'm not about to compare Elfride Baum to Shakespeare, but Shakespeare plays are so often adapted to any different situation, like another time, another country, the present, without changing a word.
Yeah.
which really amazes me. If you have the liberty of being able to change words and, character focus and so forth, it's really just endlessly adaptable. And that it works, I think, comes down to what's in the original, just the strength of that, and also how well people know the story.
Ranjit, before you go, I have to ask you, do you get into the Dark Side of the Moon, Wizard of Oz thing at all? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do either of you know what I'm talking about, Kelly and Nikki?
Yeah, a career highlight for me was when someone at a nearby college asked me to, do my historian's Wizard of Oz presentation. And they asked me, is there some kind of gimmick or hook we could use to really get students in there? And I said, well, you could always talk about the Dark Side of the Moon thing, and maybe just, if it syncs up so perfectly, just do that. Sync up Dark Side of the Moon and flip it, after 45 minutes with the 1939 Wizard of Oz film. And so someone did that.
Amazing.
I have it on a DVD still. It does work in particular places. There's a lot of movies that would work with Dark Side of the Moon, but there's a lot more that wouldn't. So
So for people who don't know this theory, right, it's this idea that if you take Pink Floyd's album Dark Side of the Moon and you start playing it at this particular moment, I think it's when the third lion roar at the beginning of the MGM whatever to the 1939 movie, that it syncs up perfectly. And there's all these moments where the witch is riding her bicycle and there's a bell ringing in the album, and then there's a line in Dark Side of the Moon that says black, and that's when the Wicked Witch first appears. And then the most famous one is, can you tell that I've done this? The most famous one is when they first go in through the door and it turns Technicolor. That's the exact moment when the song Money plays on that album.
Yeah, with that jangling of coins.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
So, it's this stoner theory that has existed for a long time. I cannot tell you, one of my experiences of going to Wicked was I was watching the movie and I was realizing how little I know about Wizard of Oz, but I've seen that movie probably 15 times. But the only experience I have of watching that movie is really high with the sound off while listening to Dark Side of the Moon. And I realized, oh gosh, all those viewings did not prepare me at all. I was like, I don't think I got much of the content of the actual film, given that was my experience.
There must be someone out there who originated that, who was in a beanbag chair in their dorm room, stoned, and with both of those on at the same time. It's like, hey, this really works. Until people
I think there wasn't a magazine article or an oral history of how it went viral. But it is very fun. But it did not prepare me. I don't think there's any movie in the world that I've seen more and gleaned less information from than The Wizard of Oz, given my particular experience with it. But again, a rich text, and that's as valid an engagement with the text as any. All right. Well, this has been really fun. But our guest has been Ranjit Dighe, who is an economic history professor at SUNY Oswego and author of a bunch of papers about L. Frank Baum and Oz, as well as the book, The Historian's Wizard of Oz. But thank you so much for doing this. This has been really, really fascinating.
Thanks a lot.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And listeners, please let us know your theories, real and cockamamie. Let us know what you make of this movie and this book, and we'll see you next episode.
You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. You'll find he is a whiz of a whiz, if ever a whiz there was. If ever a whiz there was, the Wizard of Oz is one because of the wonderful things he does.
Radiotopia from PRX.